Hello, everyone, and welcome to the our six-part class on the history of Judaism, or more appropriately, the history of Jews. We did biblical history, 2 sessions of post-biblical history, American Jewish history, Israeli Jewish history, or Israel Jewish history. Either way, Israel history. And now we're coming, of course, we saved the best for the last, and that is Savannah Jewish history. I know a lot of people are very well informed about the history of Savannah, especially our community. We're the only full-time synagogue and I think full-time museum in our country, maybe anywhere, because we do both equally well. And we're going to talk today a little bit about the history of the Jews in Savannah. And it's a very interesting and incredible history. We got a couple people here on Zoom, but most people on YouTube. It'll be on our YouTube channel to watch later. So we're going to go step by step and get as much as we can in. As I said with the other ones, you can't do everything because we only have an hour and 15 minutes. But we'll talk a little bit about the history, who came, what happened, and what's going, maybe a little bit of what's going on now. So let us begin with, of course, the man himself, James Oglethorpe, who founded the settlement of Georgia as a way to protect England, which controlled Charleston, from Spain, which controlled France. And so he set this up as a place for mostly debtors. A lot of people think of a penal colony, but this wasn't Australia with hardened criminal. This was a place where people may have owed money, and sometimes not very much, but you could be in prison for a very long time. And so this was a way to bring them here. It was also for people who didn't have money, for people who were indigent or poor that still could come here and create a new life. So that's who the settlement was for. So it wasn't for hardened criminals. And so they arrived in February of 1733. And of course, on July 11th of 1733, 41 Jews arrived on the William and Sarah. So before we get to what they did when they came on to the shores, how did those 41 Jews, or 42 who left England, one died en route, how did they get on the boat, and why did they get on the boat? So most of the people on the boat, as we know, were Portuguese refugees. So they had left Portugal under very difficult circumstances. The leader of this group was Samuel Nunez. He was born Diego Nunez Ribeiro in Portugal, somewhere in the late 1660s. And he had a family. He was a very respected physician, probably even served the Grand Inquisitor of Portugal himself. He was actually helping people to escape to England who were like him, and that was a crypto-Jew or a converso. Some people say Marrano. Marrano is a derogatory term, meaning swine or pig. So a converso, someone who is descended from people who are forced to convert to Catholicism, but secretly were Jewish. So he was very prominent, helping people kind of an underground to get people out into England, and he got caught. I think the story is that somebody was jealous who was a rival, and they got an assistant or someone to work as one of the supporters in his house, even a maid maybe, and they caught him. But because he was so prominent, he was not killed, he was tortured, gave up his family, eventually regained some of his reputation, and eventually was able to sneak out on a boat. The story is they snuck out to go on a boat just to go around the bay there outside of Portugal, and the British captain took him to London. Now remember, he was already old for the time period. I mean, he was already in his, he was old. He was in his 50s, maybe even 60s already by the time he came to London. They didn't quite fit in. I mean, remember, they were poor. because they'd left everything behind. Didn't speak the language. He briefly worked as a physician for the poor of the synagogue Bevis Marks, the oldest synagogue in England at the time. And so when they were given the opportunity to come to America, they grabbed onto it along with 3 German families, actually 2 Jewish families who were German and 1 German individual. And they came to America looking for brighter pastures, basically, like everybody else. That's why everybody came to America. Most people came to America for that reason. And so they arrived on July 11th. Story as we know, the community in Savannah was decimated by plague. They used to think it was yellow fever, and now they think it was the flu. Anyway, the doctor had been killed, and people were dying left and right, maybe as much as half of the whole community. And so Dr. Ribeiro came on. He'd already changed his name to Nunez. He changed it when he went to England. He wanted a more Jewish name, so he chose Samuel Nunez. So in exchange for treating the colony, Oglethorpe first offered him and his family rights, but he wouldn't come over. Eventually, everybody was offered full rights. Now, you might say, wow, that's pretty generous to give full rights to a group of Jews. It is very generous for the time period. We have to remember, there had only been one Jewish boat of Jews coming over, one Jewish boat of Jews, one group of Jews ever coming over together to form a community, and that was accidental in 1654 when they were escaping, as we mentioned before, from Recife when the Portuguese took back Brazil from the Dutch. They ended up in New York, which was New Amsterdam, petitioned to stay, and they were allowed to stay. This was a larger group, 41, largest immigration of Jews to America. Now, there have been Jews coming here, of course. There was a small Jewish community in Charleston already, Jewish communities in New York, and of course, Rhode Island. There are Jews who were traders and trappers and adventurers, but this is the first time a group came here to found a synagogue. So they were allowed to found a synagogue and get full rights, one, because the charter didn't specifically say no Jews could come here. It said no Catholics because of Spain. It said no lawyers, no slave trading, no alcohol. It didn't specifically say no Jews, and Oglethorpe had to consult a lawyer in Charleston, I believe, because there were no lawyers allowed here, to make sure that he could do this. And by the time the backers in England sent word, don't let the Jews stay, Oglethorpe had already given them rights here. And so they came here and they thrived. You had 41 Jews, plus a boat of German Jews who came in 1737. So you had German Jews, the original families, then the other families, and you had Sephardic Jews. They founded Kahal Kadosh Mikveh Israel, the Holy Congregation of Mikveh Israel, the Hope of Israel, as a Sephardic and Ashkenazic synagogue. They never built a building because there was a lot of religious difference, to say the least, between an Ashkenazic group and Sephardic group. It's not like today in America where we know each other, and we've been in America for a very long time, but even here, Sephardic synagogues have a lot of differences from Ashkenazic synagogues. And all the synagogues in America, all 2 of them were Sephardic. Most of the Jews coming to America in the 18th century at this point were Sephardic. There are notes left from non-Jewish members of the Savannah community, wondering why the Jews are always arguing each other over food, for one. But as we know, things can be very tense when different groups of people are together, especially when they speak different languages, especially when they have different backgrounds. The German Jews came probably a little bit more prosperous at this point because the Portuguese had left everything behind. But anyway, they weren't able to build a building. They went to services at people's homes. And it stayed this way until 1742. Now, what's also important to remember, is that during this period, Savannah probably most likely became the largest Jewish community in America. That's right, Savannah was the largest Jewish city in America. Write that down, all you people who don't believe it, but it is true. And the city that became the largest community after Savannah was Charleston, which was the largest Jewish city in America for about 100 years. So the Jewish population was significant also in comparison to the rest of the community. At one point, they were a very large percentage of the country and a very large percentage of the members, a large percentage of the Jews in the country, and at one time, a very large percentage of the people in Savannah. And it was very fortuitous that Oglethorpe let such a large group. I think if it had been one or two, it would not have been an issue. Most communities would have probably allowed that, but a whole group, and I think the number of original settlers was down to 120. So you can do the math. And that's pretty amazing. And so when they arrived, they brought the oldest, or the first Torah scroll to come to America, which we still have. In 1737, the group of German Jews brought that second Torah to America. So we have the two oldest Torah scrolls in America. And they thrived because they were given rights. Now, thrive is, of course, a very interesting use of words because they're basically knocking down trees and building a city as they're here. And so they're all doing as well as anybody else. They have a house, they have a land to farm from, they have, and they have a garden area. And very interestingly enough, all the men are required to serve in the militia. Why? Because again, Savannah protected Charleston from Spain in Florida. Only one time previously had an American or a Jew on American soil been allowed to serve in the militia, and he had to petition to do so. Here they're required, which is really quite a wonderful gift because you know if you serve in the military or the militia, you really are considered part of society in many groups, and that's what happened here. So they lived here. The community grew a little bit. But of course, things didn't go so smoothly because in 1742, there was a war called the War of Jenkins' Ear. A man named Richard Jenkins, who was a boat captain, was captured by the Spanish. They thought he was, secretly taking illegal cargo, whether that was true or not. They cut off his ear, and he went back to England, and immediately they went to war 8 years later, I think. Yeah, that's right, 8 years later or so. When they wanted to go to war, this was the convenient excuse. And so when England and Spain went to war, there was fear in Savannah from the Portuguese that if the Spanish took Savannah, then all the Portuguese who had illegally left Portugal would be subject to punishment because Spain and Portugal were really connected, and the Portuguese had illegally left Portugal, escaped the Inquisition, so the entire families could have been killed. And so all of the Portuguese left. Two of Samuel Nunez's sons, Daniel and Moses, actually eventually moved back. But that was the end of us being the largest Jewish community in America. We're pretty close now. There's maybe 4,000 to 5,000 Jews here, and there's probably just this much more in New York. So we're really close. I think we're going to catch up soon. So during these years, the Jews living in Savannah, which trickled to a very small number, continued to thrive. It's reported in 1750 there might only be 16 Jews left in Savannah. Abraham and Abigail Minus, the Minus family, Daniel Moses Nunez, who I mentioned, who came back down, and the family of Benjamin and his new wife Hannah Sheftel. So the Sheftels and the Minuses were the two German families that came on the original boat. And what's interesting is that both families had kids after they arrived the next year or two, And those were the first two non-Native Americans born in Georgia. So the first two non-Native Americans born in Georgia were Jewish. And so these families all did fairly well. Benjamin and his sons, they owned a lot of land and farmland and properties. They're going to do a lot more later. Abraham Minus also did pretty well, but when he died, his wife Abigail Minus, who was probably the most famous member in the history of our congregation, one of the most important Jewish women of the 18th century, if not the most important Jewish woman in the 18th century, inherited his property. Instead of getting married and giving all the wealth to her new husband, she went and bought thousands of acres of farmland. She bought town lots. She built pubs and became a very wealthy woman. Some would say maybe the wealthiest woman or single woman in America. And that is, she helped fund the American Revolution, as did Mordechai Sheftel. We'll talk more about that later. Moses Nunez also, along with his brother, became very wealthy, and they were very active in the Masonic temples. They, some say, founded a lodge, or Daniel became the highest ranking person in the lodge. Moses became an Indian interpreter. He was appointed searcher for the port. So both of them became very prominent. And of course, the Sheftel family, which is still in our congregation, became very prominent as well. And again, it all depended what's going on. And because Savannah was much more welcoming than a lot of places, and because the Jewish population had really gotten quite small, there was very little restrictions placed upon them, certainly in business. And so it really helped that they came here at the very beginning and were here for the founding of basically every organization just about, except for Christ Church, was founded after the Jewish population arrived. And so these families started to do very well. Of course, in the in the 1770s, excuse me, Mordechai Sheftel and his brother Levi Sheftel bought land so they could put two cemeteries, which we're still responsible for. One was for the family, one was for any other Jewish person who was anywhere in the area, maybe in the entire state of Georgia, would be buried. Remember, by 1773, there was exactly how many synagogues in Georgia? One. We were the only synagogue in Georgia until the 19th century. And so what we also started to see was a lot of work in the mercantile area, which would be very prominent for Jews in the 19th and 20th century, but started in the 18th century as the Jewish community here, the Sheftels and the Minuses, if they were here, and the Nunezes, and some of the other families would work with places in Europe, especially the Dutch and the British, and work with those in the Caribbean and other settlements in North America. And they'd be doing business together, also marriages. Obviously, there wasn't that many Jewish people in America, so Mordechai Sheftel and Daniel Nunez both married women from this part of the world. Actually, Mordechai Sheftel's wife was from Charleston, so was Daniel. Levi Sheftel married somebody from one of the islands. And so business was good. The community was still very small in Savannah. It grew a little bit. They were definitely having services. Benjamin Sheftel and especially Mordechai were very religious, and so they were holding services in people's homes, but not in a building, which we'll learn about later. So the population is small, but stable and thriving in Savannah. And this is throughout the period. Of course, it depended, as always, with what was going on. So, of course, next we talk about the Revolution. Now, there were more Jews in Savannah by the time of the Revolution, so you'd think a lot of them might have supported the British because it was a British colony that had been so supportive to them. But most of the Jews in Savannah and in the country, there were some Tories, but most supported the revolution because America was different than Europe. Europe had this religious intolerance, this hierarchical society in which everybody had their place and you stayed in your place. The people in America didn't want that. They liked their freedom. And so this idea of being in a land of religious freedom with equality, not relegated to any specific area, was really quite enticing. So most American Jews did support the revolution. So during this time, several Jews became prominent. Most prominent of all was Mordechai Sheftel, one of our members. He would become the highest ranking Jew in the military. He, of course, would be a colonel at first. He was also, and we'll talk about some of the other things he did, but he was also considered by many to be the leader of the Savannah rebels. He was called that by the governor himself. And so he, along with others, really became part of the revolution. He became the person who selected our delegate to the Second Continental Congress, in which, of course, the Declaration of Independence was signed. I just forgot his ranking he was given. I just forgot to write it. It was something general. Ellen, do you remember what his ranking was? Procurement. I just can't believe I forgot the name, what it was. Okay. I'm not really good with
I'm sorry, I don't remember it's a very long name, but he's responsible for feeding, clothing, arming.
Right. So it's like something general. So basically we'll say general. We'll say 5-star general. Why not? 5-star general, him in Washington and FDR. Not FDR and Eisenhower. So anyway, he was captured with his son Sheftel at the Battle of Savannah. In a bit of an ironic moment, as the Continental Army swam across the river, Sheftel didn't know how to swim. He was only 15 at the time, and so Mordechai stayed behind and was captured with his son. Why is that ironic? Because Mordechai was a religious man, and the Talmud says very clearly there are 3 things you do for your son. You find him a wife, you find him a vocation, and you teach him how to swim. Those are the 3 obligations of a father. Sheftel may have been on the spectrum a little bit. We don't know. He was a prominent lawyer, but he was kind of socially inept. He might not have been able to swim. Anyway, Mordechai stayed in prison, on prison ships mostly, and his son was eventually released, and he actually went back and was a very prominent fighter for the revolution. He went on some very daring missions, apparently. And so Mordechai Sheftel stayed on prison ships. In recent years, there was a minister's diary was found. And in it, he talked about his relationship with Mordechai Sheftel because he was also a captured patriot. And he talked about how terribly Mordechai Sheftel was treated especially considering he was an officer. They would dip his utensils and that of his son before his son was released in lard and then give it to them before meals, knowing that he couldn't use his utensils to eat. When that minister escaped jumping off ship, he made it to the shore to run away, but somebody else was drowning. He went out to save him, and he drowned. And his body was then put on the ship, and Mordechai Sheftel offered to use the last of his few dollars or pennies to pay for a burial for this minister. And the ship's captain said, no, rebels don't deserve funerals. And we found this out about this relationship recent years when the diary of that reverend was found. So, of course, if you didn't know, we win the revolution. Just to put it out there, just in case you didn't hear the news. It was in all the papers. And so we also learn about some other people, because along with Mordechai Sheptel, Chaim Solomon most famously, and of course, Abigail Minus gave a lot of money to support the revolution. They never received it back. Chaim Solomon, Mordechai Sheptel both went bankrupt. Abigail Minus did not. She did not give all of her money. Mordechai eventually ended up in Philadelphia, had to restart his life, and has made his way back to Savannah. But after the revolution, the congregation continued to meet, and the community even grew a little. Obviously, they even made plans to build a permanent synagogue. It didn't work out, which is great, because there was a big fire that destroyed a lot of Savannah in 1796, and the synagogue would have been destroyed, but it wasn't. So in 1820, they finally build their first synagogue. For those of you who know Savannah, if you've ever been on Liberty, just a little bit west of Bull Street, it's in the parking lot. It was in what is now the parking lot of the Soho Girl. And in 1820, there were about 100 Jews in the community by this time, a lot larger, of course, than the 17 in 1750. It's famous because during this, they played organ music when they brought the scrolls, the Torah scrolls, into their new sanctuary. An organ had never been played for a Jewish event or Jewish services in the history of America. It had only been done once in one place before this. It had been done in 1800-ish in Germany. So we're probably the first congregation in America, and maybe the second since probably the time of the Talmud, to play musical instruments on Shabbat. Now, they escaped the fire in 1796 because they didn't have a building, but in 1829 there was a fire that destroyed the synagogue, and they decided they're going to build another one on the same place but make it out of brick. So they built another. This one was just a little bit farther, Perry Lane and Whitaker, actually. And so this was another big to-do. So we have a bigger synagogue, we have a larger congregation. America is now starting to see the influx of German immigrants. Because remember, most of the Jews in America in the 18th century were Sephardic, with the exception of the Germans in Savannah. But German immigrants started to come, and of course, more and more. So by the 1850s, at least half of the congregation were these new German arrivals. Interestingly enough, those new German arrivals now in our congregation are the ones who've been here the longest, because we still have many members whose family came over in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s from this German immigration. And so by 1860, there were 345 Jews in America. I'm sorry, 345 Jews in Savannah. It's not a lot, but there wasn't that. There was only, at this time, I'm guessing 150,000. By 1880, there's 250,000 Jews. A lot of the Jews haven't come over, so there's probably going to be maybe 100, 150,000 at the most at this time period. The congregation is debating, as you can imagine, whether they're going to keep some of the Sephardic roots, or go Ashkenazic German. But by 1853, we hire our first rabbi, Rabbi Jacob Rosenfeld. And remember the name Jacob, Rabbi Jacob Rosenfeld is an immigrant. And we become kind of a Sephardic-ish, but no longer. We kind of been Sephardic, but a little bit Ashkenazic. And by his term in the 1860s, we have so many more German immigrants that we become kind of an Ashkenazic congregation. Now, why did I say remember the name Rabbi Jacob Rosenfeld? Well, I'm not 100% sure of the story of how it happens, although it does happen. He did not get along with the president of the synagogue. First time in Jewish or Christian or Muslim history that the clergy does not get along with the president of the house of worship. For those of you who don't know me well, that is sarcasm. Anyway, this is the story I heard off the record. He was forbidden to go to a bris. of some in the congregation by the president. He went to the bris and he was fired. Now, is that true? Who knows? There are certainly other things. And what does he do? He goes and starts another synagogue and names it B'nai B'rith Jacob, after his first name. So that is BBJ, which is the Orthodox synagogue. So we ended up with two Orthodox synagogues in America and in Savannah at the same time. Theirs was probably a little bit more traditional as time went on, whereas it was more liberal. And so what we saw was a lot of excitement in many ways, but also a lot of struggles because Savannah doesn't become this major metroplex later, especially after the Civil War, which we're going to talk about. But let's go to the Civil War. So we have a rabbi, 1861, coincidentally the date to the year of the Civil War starts. We have two synagogues here, and we have a war, Civil War. So a lot of people wonder, what did the Jewish community think about slavery, which of course was the issue, or certainly one of the major issues of the Civil War. There were Jews who did have slaves. That is a fact, and it's something we have to deal with like everybody else who had them. You might say, well, you're Jewish. Yeah, that's true. But we have to remember, a lot of people who say Jews had slaves say it in such a negative, macro way, as to say Jews controlled the slave trade. The majority of slave owners were Jewish. You hear this, and that, of course, could not be farther from the truth. First of all, we were a very tiny percentage of America and a very tiny percentage in the South by this time. Most of the Jews were living up north. But there were Jews who did have slaves, and most Jews who fought in the Civil War fought in the South. Some did fight for the North. Now, why? Because this is their home. This is who you live with. And so, like everything else, we fought for the South. And obviously, Jews died in the war on both sides. Of course, our congregation helped our sister to buy a boat, an iron ship for the Civil War, for the Confederates, which sank really quickly. Our congregation helped with other congregation to feed Jewish soldiers on Passover, both Confederates and Union soldiers. But again, this is the fact that we did serve in the Civil War and the Confederacy, and some Jews did have slaves. And you ask which Jews? Well, Jews who probably had large plantations, or if they didn't have plantations, had money. So some did, some didn't. There were very famous rabbis who supported slavery. There were very famous rabbis who were really against it. It's an unfortunate thing that we need to live with. But after the Civil War, Savannah continues to be a home for Jews. And as I mentioned, since it's not this major center point for the economy, is a lot more stable here than other places. And so the Jews who lived here, a lot of them are doing pretty well. And we'll talk a little bit about others, because as Jews move in, they go more and more to mercantilism, as the German Jews tend to do, because obviously, if you are Jewish here, you probably have a cousin or relatives in New York or Europe or other places where they have factories. And so you have access to merchandise that other people don't. And so a lot of Jews in the community did very well. The Guggenheimers, some of you, he was a peddler. He ends up owning stores. A lot of stores were owned by Jews because they had this access, they had experience in this area. They were literate, which was a very important, I often mention this, literacy is a skill that is important today. But if you were literate in the 19th century or earlier, when most people weren't, it was an even greater skill. And so we see that they are forming these stores. And we also have to remember that during the Civil War, as with any war, who won the Civil War? Now, most people will say the North. Obviously, the North won the Civil War, but they're not the only winners. The winners of any war are the people who are selling the stuff to both sides, whether it's guns, which of course are so famous from being in, well, you need food, you need boxes, you need clothing, you need everything in bulk because you are feeding and supplying these two giant armies where there weren't armies before. And so when you are Jewish and you go into the business, some of the Jews in the community were in selling rifles or powder, or you sell blankets or anything, nails, or the drugs, or the cotton, which actually, came, that is where made so many Jews who were in these fields made money. Obviously, Savannah survived the war. It's very famous because Sherman did not destroy Savannah. He gave it to Lincoln as a Christmas gift, along with some guns and ammunition and cotton and probably a lot of money. So Savannah survived, and we see that the Jewish community survives and continues to thrive. And after the war, we still see a lot of this mercantilism, mostly, again, German Jews. We still have a few people here, the Sheftals, the Minuses, from the original settlers. But the bulk is going to be this German immigrant group. Now, in 1878, we decide to build a new synagogue. Rafael de Castro Lewin was the leader of this effort, or one of the leaders, and they start to build in 1876. However, under this man, he started seeing what was going on in the rest of the Jewish world, and that was a softening of the upkeep of certain religious traditions. So when they built our synagogue, we were still an Orthodox synagogue, but it was mixed seating, which could never happen today. If you're mixed seating, you're not going to be part of the Orthodox world. So mixed seating, no second day to festivals, shorter service, a mixed choir, men and women, which of course would never have been allowed. And if you got married, you didn't need a chuppah. You also didn't need to cover your head for services. Now, again, today that would not fly in the conservative and definitely not fly in the Orthodox movement, but this is the 19th century. It's still the Wild West. And so we became the more traditional Orthodox synagogue, and we became the more liberal Orthodox synagogue, and BBJ became the more traditional one. And although the BBJ they didn't keep a lot of their history, but they built their building in 1867, and it was a big deal. The mayor came, and the aldermen came. So if you're wondering why did we build our synagogue or start meeting about building our synagogue in 1869? Well, I'm not saying why, but I am saying that BBJ had just built this beautiful new synagogue that was bigger and better. And so, I think they began building in 1867. They finished it a few years later. So we built ours shortly afterwards with this beautiful, it's gorgeous, obviously stained glass, the BBJ synagogue. This one is now part of SCAD, the art college in town. And as all of this is going on after the war, we start also creating different organizations, post-war organizations, social organizations, B'nai B'rith, obviously, the Hebrew Benevolent Society. So a lot of the Jewish organizations are going to be built here. Most of them, though, are going to be built founded after the immigration of Eastern Europeans. But Savannah is already doing this. Now, the railroads, of course, start coming through Savannah. And so if you're in the mercantile business, you're doing well, and you're wholesaling and all these things. But you also, once the trains come in, you see a lot more manufacturing coming in. and the South, including Savannah. So a lot of Jews went into this area, including the Myers brothers. Herman Myers will become the first Jewish mayor of Savannah, and maybe the most popular mayor. He is the mayor who's considered bringing Savannah into the modern age, and is one of the largest funerals in Savannah history. And so we see business doing well. Savannah is not growing like some of the other cities like Charleston and Atlanta will later, but we see it prospering. And we see that it has a lot to do with the fact that we've been here so long. I mean, some of the organizations in town teach us about this. For instance, the oldest orphanage in America, and for a long time, the longest surviving orphanage, was founded with funds that were helped to be raised by Mordechai Sheftel, because he helped start an organization that was for Jews and non-Jews that helped to later create the funds for this orphanage. And so it was fascinating to see how Mordechai Sheftel could work with other clergy. And remember, this is the 18th century, and with other wealthy people in town for the good of the community. And it's really quite astounding. So you had the Sheftels, you had the Minuses, of course, Levi and Mordechai and Benjamin before them. And it is really great. Now, so the organization, I just forgot the name. Of course, I'm going to forget the name, but I will find it later. So ask me later, because it is not the orphanage it's called. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't remember it, but I'll think of it later. Now, after the Civil War, after the building of the Congregational Synagogue in 1878, things are going to change in America in ways they could never have imagined. And I mentioned this earlier. Whereas we're doing well, you have our crowd, famous people like Guggenheim and Levi Strauss making a lot of money. You have very successful German immigrants, and some German immigrants from the 18th century and many more from the 19th century, like the Myers brothers, who, they made their money in bourbon and whiskey and tobacco. You have now an incredible influx of Jews coming in from Eastern Europe in numbers that were unfathomable in America. Remember, in America, 250,000 Jews in 1880, spread out. Well, get a higher percentage certainly Northeast. But then you're going to get 3 million, 3.5 million Jews coming in over the next 40 years. And they're going to completely overwhelm, as we mentioned, the German Jewish community that wants to help them, but doesn't actually want them in their synagogues, which is what we see across the country. But this is when a lot of these organizations are going to be found, and we're going to talk about. So the population of Savannah is going to boom from 1890 to 1900. It's not just Jewish immigrants coming from all over the place in Eastern Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, but from other places as well. And the Jewish population of Savannah is going to soar to about 5,000 in 1918. 5,000 Jews. If you're wondering, there are not 5,000 Jews today. That's going to be probably the largest number of Jews we've ever had in this community. People talk about today, we have 4,000 to 5,000, but they probably had more then, just because these immigrants are coming here in such large numbers, and they're going to whatever city they can get entrance to. So a lot of them came here, probably worked for a few years, and then went somewhere else to greener pastures or to larger areas, or found cousins other places, or were sponsored to go other places. So the first Russians coming, or the Eastern Europeans or Russian Jews coming here pretty soon after the Tsar is assassinated in 1881. And some of them want to join the congregation, some don't want to. Some join the other congregation. There is an attempt to found a what would be kind of like a proto-conservative congregation in the 1880s, a third congregation that is Orthodox but much more liberal, or Reform even, but a little bit more. That falls apart. They're not able to form this congregation in the 1880s, but in 1903, Congregation Agudat Achim is formed. 1904, Mikveh Israel will become officially Reform, which we've been leaning to for many years. And this is, of course, the time period where Herman Myers would become mayor. Some of his family is still in our congregation. He was an alderman before, and he was mayor, I think, 2 or 3, from 1895 through 1907, but there were 2 years where he wasn't there. And what we see is in the 19th and really the 20th century, things go in different ways at different time periods for the three synagogues. In 1907, BBJ builds another large synagogue downtown, and they start a Sunday school. They start having a much larger membership. Again, a lot of people were reticent to welcome Eastern Europeans into their congregations. They still wanted to support them, but it was kind of like, the backwards cousin. But of course, by the next generation or 2 generations, nobody cares anymore. George Solomon, the rabbi of congregation, our rabbi, the first rabbi who graduated from Hebrew Union College. He serves here for longer than anybody. He'll be here for over 40 years. He'll start to bring in speakers because we're losing attendance. People are not coming to services. Again, this is a time period where services are not as popular unless you're really very traditional. So he even has to suspend services for a while. He brings in orders, try to pick up. And of course, as this is going on, these three synagogues are finding their ground. It's going to eventually be the Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. The Conservative synagogue will inevitably become the largest, as it would be around the country, because the Conservative movement really welcomed Eastern European Jews more than the others. And funny enough, a lot of the Conservative movement's congregations and organizations were funded by Reform Jews who wanted to help these people, but were happy that they went to a different place. So it's one of the ironies. But of course, when World War I starts, we see a lot of Jews then, of course, start to serve in the war, including Rabbi Solomon, who served as well. And we see a lot of Jews serve in the war. As we know, after the war for us, 1918, they'll have the largest Jewish population probably in our history. But it's before the war, with these Eastern Europeans coming in, that we start, and Rabbi Solomon was a big, if not probably the leader in the idea of starting the Federation and the Jewish Educational Alliance. The Jewish Educational Alliance was now the JCC. We still call it the Jewish Educational Alliance because it was originally founded to help these Eastern European immigrants. And of course, the Federation was also used to help fund and to bring funds. Now, in 1919, Agudat Achim builds their synagogue downtown. They are growing. They have a cantor. And the community continues to thrive, although we don't grow to the numbers of Charleston or Atlanta. We're not going to, but we're thriving because, of course, it's the Roaring '20s. The synagogue, which had avoided a fire at one point, had another fire. We have another fire, unfortunately. So 1927, we have the fire in the spire, which happened because somebody left a blowtorch on, is what happened, basically. They were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the the laying of the cornerstone for the synagogue. Somebody left a blowtorch on. The fire department came quickly and found no fire because they went to BBJ on accident. And then they came to Mikveh Israel. They saved the synagogue, people saved the Torahs and a lot of the stuff in it, but of course the organ was damaged and they had to really renovate. And as is the case, who offered us their building to use? Churches, the other two synagogues. Everybody was supportive, as we have been. We've hosted other congregations during my time here. Several churches have used our facilities on Sunday when they're doing renovations or if something has happened, just as we used other churches and other synagogues facilities. For instance, when we were building our current building, not our sanctuary, but our current other building in 2003. So as time went on, of course, you have the Depression, and another congregation is attempted to be formed, connected to the conservative movement, because I don't think AA was officially part of it. When this congregation failed, AA became the conservative congregation officially. And so by the 1930s, as I mentioned, a lot of people came in, but of course with the Depression, the people wanted going to other places, and with Savannah never having the resources that some of the other big cities had, a lot of people left, especially if you were born and raised here and you got a job, you might go somewhere else. And so our community shrank to about 3,000 in the 1940s. Congregation BBJ then would build their new synagogue in the 1960s, and Congregation Agudat Achim in the 1970s. Downtown became, as time went on, a little bit more desperate. It wasn't the thriving area it was today. And of course, after World War II especially, where so many Jews, 500,000 Jews served, and with the money coming to people to build homes after World War II, you saw people building south of here. And there were several Jewish families who had architects or builders who built large areas. And so a lot of Jews moved south into what would be I don't know if they called it then, but it would be kind of the outskirts of town. Not anymore. But so that's when you saw, and eventually there would be an Eruv, when it became okay to become more and more religious in America, the Eruv, the line that demarcates an area that's considered your home. So if you're Orthodox or conservative, you can carry. And so people started moving to Haversham Woods and areas like this, even, and of course, after World War II, started moving into areas around the city itself. And you saw continuously the businesses headed by Jews to be numerous. Broughton Street and West Broad Street, which is now MLK, were filled with Jewish businesses. People in our congregations whose family have been here 50 years or 70 years or 80 years or more, most likely at one point had a business somewhere down there. Adler's department store, of course, is famous. I know people had drug stores, alcohol stores, Levy's department store, of course. There's still Globe Shoe Store is still there. So that was really the area. And a lot of people ask, what about segregation? And this is also a difficult thing for us because we were living in the South. Now, did Jews in the South protest segregation overtly? Not usually, because their families were here. Most of the Jews who were civil rights leaders were coming from the North because they were coming here, but they didn't have their families here. If you were here, you did other things. And this I hear a lot from people in our community who are living, of course, in the 60s and earlier, or they talk about their parents. that the Jewish merchants generally were paying a higher salary to the African Americans and giving them more responsibilities. First person to be a salesperson, the first person to work at the cash register, first person to be the head of the supplies, or a lot of them were coming from the Jewish community. And so it was really more underneath without making a big ruckus because we lived here. Now, is this an excuse? I don't know. Again, it's not like slavery. There were no slaves, but they were part of the system. And the Jewish community was very small here. We have to remember. And I think a lot of them were worried about rocking the boat too much and what would be the repercussions to them and their families. So they did things where people knew what they were doing, but they weren't going to the newspapers and saying, I just made somebody the first cashier, or I made somebody the first salesperson, or the first person who was head of our supplies. And so it was a fine balance they had to negotiate. And you have to remember, rabbis did too. One of the rabbis who came to Savannah, who served after George Solomon, I think was a very big civil rights advocate, but early on in the 40s and 50s. And he came here right away, and this, again, may not be 100% accurate, but came right away talking about the issues of segregation before he'd even got to know people in the community. And it's very hard to lead people until you get to know them. But certainly by the 60s, the community was very much in support of what was going on nationally. And again, it's always difficult to look at the past. But again, I think the Jewish community did what they could. Could they have done more? Probably, but we can always say that. So, of course, what we see today is a continual support for our congregation in the community. We had another Jewish mayor in the 1980s. Throughout the history of Savannah, we have had Jewish leaders generally on the founding board of any organization. Yes, there's one or two which didn't allow Jews, but by and large, whether it's the Masons or the Rotary or the Kiwanis or a supper club or this club or this organization, Jewish leaders have been invited to be not only on the original boards, but often presidents of the organization. And we see this throughout the history here, which today is not as big of a deal. I think it's very common today, but in the 18th century and 19th century, I would imagine was very rare. And so we're quite proud of the fact that Savannah has been so good to the Jewish community. Today, there are 4,000 to 5,000. Of course, we have 3 synagogues, we have a Chabad, and we continue to have the Federation and the JA. B'nai B'rith Jacob, which is the Orthodox congregation, is the oldest Orthodox congregation in continuous use in the South. And Agud Achim is, again, one of the really wonderful congregations in the conservative movement. And Congregation Mikveh Israel continues to be here thriving as well. And so what we see as our congregation and the Savannah Jewry itself is an amalgamation of Jews who came here in 1732, 1733, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, mixed in with later Germans, with later Eastern Europeans, with a smidgen of Russians who came into the 1990s after the fall of the wall, and living together, doing the best we can in a community that has been very supportive of the Jewish community. Yes, there have been issues, certainly, as there are every place, but by and large, Savannah has been as good to the Jewish community as any city in history, maybe. I'm not that great of a historian to make that, but it's really been a good place. And so, Ellen, anybody else who's here? Susan, you guys have any questions before we conclude?
No, no questions.
I'm just going to add one or two more things. Now, a couple of interesting side notes about our congregation. One, when Julia Gordon Low founded the Girl Scouts In 1912, she chose 5 women to be the Girl Scout leaders, and 3 were from our congregation. So 60% of the Girl Scout leaders originally were Jewish. Pretty impressive. Not only that, the very first very first Girl Scout cookies came from Gottlieb's Kosher Bakery. They won a contest with, in case you ever want to know, oatmeal chocolate chip. You don't see very many oatmeal chocolate chip cookies, but I imagine it's delicious. And so this was the Depression. They bought almost $600 of cookies. Somebody had the brilliant idea that girls could sell cookies. At the time, there were people who probably thought it was idiotic, but man, what a genius. And so Jewish Girl Scout Girl Scout cookies have been kosher pretty much since then. They're still kosher to this day. Nick Vissel started confirmation in 1880, copying from some of the churches. And we have a confirmation chain that goes all the way to 1935. Prominent Jews have played a part in Savannah history. Hyman Whitcover, who came to Savannah in the 19th century, was one of the architects who really designed and did so much for the community, a lot of it during Herman Meyer's administration. He designed City Hall, the Masonic Temple, and the B'nai B'rith Jacob Synagogue. We've had so many builders and leaders in our community that if we listed how many people, it would go on forever. City Council, county commissioners, city council, mayors, as we mentioned, leaders, civic leaders. So it's incredible the number of people. And I think we also mentioned in our museum, if you haven't been there, that Samuel Nunez, of course, who was the doctor that saved Savannah, whose 2 sons moved down here, Moses and Daniel, a year after they had left, became very prominent. His great-grandson would be Commodore Levy, who saves Monticello. He was a big fan of Thomas Jefferson when they were going to demolish Monticello after he died because his family was bankrupt. He bought it and renovated, and we have Monticello today because of this wonderful military Jewish leader. So it's an incredible run we've had here.
Rabbi?
Yes, Ellen.
I have one question. It's not where you're at, but 1737, you said there was a second boatload of Jews who came?
I believe so, yes.
And they brought that second Torah. I didn't know this.
Yeah. So we have 2 old Torahs. They're both from the 1400s,
Right.
both on deerskin, which is pretty rare. They had to be able to, they're excellent shape considering what they've gone through. Most Torah scrolls, after they're no longer legible, are buried. There's only very few Torah scrolls as old as ours. There's one that is from around 1200 they found, but full Torah scrolls with all 5 books of Moses are very rare. So our 2 are 2 of the oldest in the world, and certainly the 2 oldest in America. We don't know which one is older. We know which one got here first, but we don't know which one is older. They're both from the 1400s, from Spain, Portugal, or maybe North Africa. That's all we know.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? All right, so this will conclude our 6-part Jewish history course. Of course, you can go online to our YouTube page to see, again, biblical history, 2 sessions on post-biblical history, American history, Israeli history, and Savannah history. What a ride it has been for our Jewish community. Who knows where we're going to go in the future? I mean, obviously, we're going to go to space eventually. But besides the obvious of us going to another planet and settling there, who knows what's going to happen. But again, we're thriving in America. And as I mentioned as well, almost all Jews today live in America or Israel, which means almost all Jews, the vast majority of Jews in the world today. And this is one of my favorite statistics, and the vast majority, 95%, that's a guess, maybe probably higher, live in countries where they vote for their leaders. Think about that. Most Jews in the world today fill out a ballot for who their local leaders and their federal or country leaders are going to be. That is something nobody could have planned of several hundred years ago. And so we remain very fortunate that that is the case. So we look forward to the future. And again, if anybody has any ideas of anything else they'd like us to teach about or have classes on, please let us know. I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful week. And we look forward to studying with you in the future. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.